Hi class, it's Miss Miller, and today I want to talk to you about how to examine poetry beyond TPSFASST. Now I know there are some of you who are perhaps unfamiliar with TPSFASST, and that is simply just an approach that's used in literature to help sort of delineate a poem. And so even though poetry, it can be a bit misleading in terms of complexity, because poems have very few words and it's oftentimes the best words in the best order, it is very difficult, or at least it could potentially be, to dissect a poem. And so we've come up with this idea of TPSFASST, where you look at the title, you can paraphrase the work, you want to see who is the speaker, and depending on your approach, you could do TPSFASST or TPSCAST, where you want to do the figurative language or the connotation. You want to see if there are any, what the attitude of a work is, the shifts. You want to examine the title, and all of this so you can really develop the theme of the poem. And so over time in teaching poetry, and I've taught it for so many years, and each year I come up with something new, I find that the original TPSFASST or TPSCAST could be a bit limited in a sense where there aren't enough letters to address in the poem. So over time, again, I have developed a more improved version of TPSFASST, and it's TPSFASSTer or TPSCASTer. And so bear with me, because obviously I've added several more components to TPSFASST or TPSCAST, and obviously it's going to take more time to sort of dissect. But with that time comes a deeper meaning of a poem, and it's almost like you will really feel a sense of completion when you use this approach. And so what I want to do today is talk to you about what this looks like, and you may find some overlaps. So I want to take a minute to talk to you about why you might see that. So for example, you might say, well, gosh, you have this I for imagery, but really that falls under figurative language. So my purpose in doing that is figurative language is such a huge umbrella that I really want to separate the I for imagery, because I really want to make sure we highlight that in a poem, because there are so many examples of imagery in a work, and I think it's important to sort of compartmentalize that and separate it from perhaps your look at figurative language. And so you might find some overlaps, but this formula ensures that nothing goes missing, that you don't leave anything out. And so this is I would say a foolproof method to addressing poetry. So we're going to look at this more enhanced approach, how the strategy works, and we're going to look at an example, one of my favorite works today, and how this looks when you actually apply it to your poem. So first, let's look at the actual example. This is the original formula, and it's a graphic organizer, and I think it may even be missing like speaker on here, but this is what one of them looked like. And as you can see, it sort of was shaken, or it's shaking. It's really slow, but if you look at the paper, it's moving, because I really want to shake things up when it comes to TPSFASST. I do want to tell you though, when we look at this, is that I don't necessarily like to fill out a graphic organizer when I'm looking at a poem. I want to write all of my different pieces or components that I find as I'm working through or explicating a work. So you're going to see that, yes, you can use this nice, neat little package here when you are doing your TPSFASST, but I really like to, when I work on poetry, it is a mess. It is messy, and I think it just shows perhaps your thinking, and it's not just this neat little package. So when we look at the poem, I like to find things wherever it is, and so it might not be in this order. Let's take a look now at what the different ways in which I may have improved TPSFASST over time. And so one of the first things I wanted to do is add 2 additional T's. So 1T is for time. I always found when we're looking at a poem that we have to look at what is the time? What's the time of day? What's the time of year? What's the season? Like, I want to know that when I'm looking at a poem. I think it really contributes to the understanding of the work. And so in any poem, there's always some indication of, what time it is. It may not be explicit, but somehow it's in the work. And also want to include what kind of a poem type is it? Is it a ballad? Is it a concrete poem, a dramatic monologue, an elegy? Is it a narrative poem, a sonnet? Some of the popular ones would be like a dramatic monologue and a sonnet, but you should be able to identify the poem type. And I think just by doing that, it also, again, contributes to the meaning. So it's not enough just to get the title. You need to know the type. You need to know the type of poem that you're working with. Now you can see, I feel like in TPSFASST, they're missing two I's. And yes, these two can fit somewhere else, but I really wanted to separate it, sort of compartmentalize this. We have imagery. I want you to look at it separately and independent of the figurative language, because there's so much happening when it comes to figurative language that we really need to separate imagery, because it's critical when looking at a work to identify that. So we have imagery because there's so many different types of imagery, and if you're ever going to find the complexity of a poem, you really have to identify the irony. And it's imperative that you set aside time and space to really address that irony in the work. And you will discover it perhaps several times. Your first reading, you might find one example of irony, and after you read it several times, you find several other examples. But I feel like the irony is super important when looking at a piece of work, and it works and functions independent of the figurative language. Some additional components, we also want to distinguish between the poet and the speaker. So the original TPSFASST includes the speaker, but there's really no mention of the poet. And so in addition to paraphrasing, and when we say paraphrasing, I say paraphrase by line. If it's a short poem, it's a lengthy one, you can break it up into stanzas, or however you want to divide up the poem, wherever you're experiencing the most difficulty. Again, the paraphrasing is taking the literal meaning of the work. But included in that is looking at who is the poet. Well, who is he? Or who is she, right? So, and being able to make this distinction, is the poet the same as the speaker, or are they two different individuals? I think that's super important to be able to identify. And sometimes the speaker is not even a person. So, you definitely want to address who the poet is. Now, in addition, we have our A for attitude, which is great. The tone, you can have several tones in a work or several attitudes, and you want to identify those and obviously have specific pieces of evidence from the text to support your choice in what you say is the attitude of the work. And the attitude obviously is the speaker's attitude or tone towards the subject. I do want to point out that even though we're just doing a quick overview of these, there are separate video lectures developed by your peers or students for each of these categories to help really refine areas of weakness for you. So if there's something where you look at this and go, gosh, I still need help with structure, well, there's a whole lecture on what that is and what that looks like. So for most of these, you'll be able to find that in our on our YouTube channel. So we have structure. How is the poem structured? Is it by stanzas, couplets? What's happening? And also the setting. There's always evidence about where the poem is taking place. It may have multiple settings. It may have one. But it's important to recognize that and acknowledge that as you're reading. Additionally, for the S's, I also wanted to include symbols. Again, you could overlap this somewhere else, but I feel like if you could just separate the symbols and make it independent of the figurative language, then you're sure to extract that from the work. So I think it's super important to be able to do that. And you may find one symbol, you may find multiple, but again, for further understanding of how a symbol functions in a work, or perhaps even how to identify it, you can look at one of the video lectures. We also have character. I wanted to add character in addition to connotation. You need to be able to identify, is there a character present in the poem in some form or fashion? Maybe there's one that is being focused on, or perhaps is being spoken to, but is there a character, and how is that character developed? In addition to the character, we have the connotation, and now we can look at figurative language, because when you look at figurative language, it's a huge umbrella. It has metaphors, similes, all sorts of figures of speech. Now you can spend time, and I think metaphors can be sometimes really challenging to identify in a work, and so if you could separate it and say, gosh, when I get to figurative language, I'm really going to focus on the figurative language, then that would be super helpful. Additionally, when you do the F for figurative language, you also want to look at the form in poems. And this is an easy one. Is it an open form or is it a closed form poem? And once you identify that, again, that will help you understand the poem as a whole and how to sort of navigate your way through the poem. And we do, like I said, have individual lectures on what form is. Now, here's the rest of tips faster. We have speaker, right? Who's talking? It could be an object for all we know. What is the sound? I think perhaps of all of the ideas expressed in tips fast, my favorite is the sound. You know, because and you have to listen to the poem, you have to hear it, you have to say it out loud to identify the sound. And you may even say, well, gosh, you know, when you think of sound, that sounds a lot like rhythm and rhyme, and so perhaps you're right in a sense, but when I think of sound, I think I'm going to look for not just the rhymes, but I want to find the assonance, the consonants, the sounds in the poem, and so forth. Next is scansion, and then obviously the scansion works with rhythm and rhyme, but the scansion is the line length and the type of feet, and so when we look at this poem, we're going to examine that as well. And then I have the E for effectiveness in a poem, you know, and all of this, what is most effective? Is it the imagery? Is it the structure? And usually if you're taking some sort of an exam on the poem, whatever is the most effective, that's perhaps the part that they will pull out to sort of generate a question to ask you about. Then we have rhyme in a poem. You know, there are different types of rhyme: the internal rhyme, the slant rhyme, the end rhyme. Rhyme is beautiful. It also contributes to the sound. And we also have rhythm, right? And that's super important too, and we're going to talk about what that looks like, and even rhyme scheme. So, you know, every year, like I said, I add more on to Tips Fast, and just in doing this video lecture, I've already thought of one more, and it's escaped my mind for a second, but when it comes back, I know it's an E. I'm going to come back and I want to talk about it. But let's take a look at what this looks like in a poem. So My Last Duchess, this is my favorite poem. It's much longer than this one. It goes on for a second page by Robert Browning, my favorite poet also. Some of his work like Orpheus Lover, great stuff. But we're going to look at what this looks like when you annotate a poem. So if you give me a second, I'm going to pull up the poem and we're going to take a look. So here is an annotation of My Last Duchess, and here's when we do tips faster. You can see it's a mess, right? And we go on and we look at the iron. You can see all the things that stand out, but I'm going to go through it. So obviously I'm not going to read the poem, but I want you to see that, look, I'm looking at the title, My Last Duchess. My type is a dramatic monologue. I've got the character, which is My Last Duchess. The poet is Robert Browning. The speaker is the Duke. And, you know, I didn't do this in this poem, but I think it's smart if you number the lines if it's not already done for you. And in this case, because it's such a lengthy poem, I paraphrased by different sections. So I took the different rhymes together, and in the first section, I sort of blocked it out myself, is paraphrase. is the Duke is admiring Fra Pandal's painting of his last Duchess. And the second one, the paraphrase, is the emphasis on the blush and the discussion of the origin of her smile. And again, this is literal. And then the third chunk that I did is the criticism of the Duchess's treatment of both the Duke and others. And then there's a section, I chunked it together, the Duke's eliminates her smiles, literally eliminates her smile, right? And then the final chunk has the Duke makes arrangements for his new wife. And then I have identified the irony, right? And I've discovered this irony in the first chunk is that the Duke admiring the late Duchess, that he is the one that he ordered to kill. Another example of irony, and there's much more, right? There's the irony, the Duke says he has no skill in speech, yet his monologue is beautifully crafted. And then we have this other chunk here, the irony, the new bride's family is willing to risk this bride's life for the dowry or the payment of her. Now, I have to say that it's really useful to work with poetry with multiple people, even one additional person, because they're going to find some irony that you aren't going to find. So you may see some and go, well, what about this? And you are right on. And there's so much more that can be done with this poem. I'm just touching the surface. This is just a first read. So imagine when you do a second and third read, or if you have a conversation or a seminar or discussion about a poem, you're going to find so much more. Then we look at the rhyme scheme, and these letters should actually be capitalized with the FF, the GG, the HH, the II, the JJ, but it doesn't start, it doesn't end there, right? It starts with AA, BB, but this is the rhyme scheme of the poem. Sort of identifying one tone or attitude from past tone, sounds unusual. There's kind of a lot of different the figurative language is like personification, right? The tablet, the blush, the eyes along her throat. We see the structure here, which is coupled and the two consecutive rhymes at the end, right? And then you have the enjambment where you have overlapping of the sentences where it doesn't end in the line at the end of the line, but it ends wherever it wants to end in the middle of the next line, or each one's got the enjambment structure. And I like to really emphasize the shifts in poems. So I would say I found more than one shift, but just for the sake of this lecture, and it's getting lengthy here, I did put a star of the shift, and it shows you the shift, like what happens before. And I found the time, by the way, the time of year. It's very insignificant, but it's here. It says the dropping of the daylight in the west. So the time of year, the last part of the spring and all of the summer. And then we have the bowl of cherries. That's usually when that takes place. The time of day, maybe it's the sunset. So I think it's imperative to find the time, and so that's my indication of it. The setting, where is the story taking place? The palace, the symbol, the painting of the Duchess, and the spot on her face perhaps could be the symbol. And then we have the stanchion, which is the iambic pentameter. And you can look over at the bottom, the last chunk here, I've numbered them. There's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you see the iambic pentameter consistent throughout the word. I want to point out how challenging this dramatic monologue must have been. I have the most respect for Browning, especially because, can you imagine the rhyme scheme here, the sounds that all of this is achieving? It's remarkable. And look at the sound in the poem. So here is the assonance I was referring to before, and I'm just taking a chunk of it. I'm not even addressing the entire poem. So we have soothe and stooping and shoes and stoop and who, and right, and then you have this alliteration of the S's, right? And it can be the internal alliteration, or it can be at the beginning. So there's so much happening in the work, and I think that I covered it. But again, like I said, many of you may come up with different ideas. I hope I got everything on here so you can see. But this is what I mean. I don't put everything in a nice, neat box. I oftentimes will just make a mess of it. So I go on to explicate it. I can talk to you about where I found it. I hope that was helpful. Again, we went over the tips fast, and I wanted you to see how important it was to, if you want to deepen your understanding of a poem, you've got to do more work, and you've got to